All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&Done, your guide to 1D&D. Today, we have new playtest packet that just came out a few days ago, and we're going to do things backwards again. So, I guess it's totally on topic, but I don't think Wizards of the Coast understands what the glossary is for. For those of you that have no idea what the term glossary is generally a thing in the back of textbooks and other things like that are supposed to be informational in nature. And what it is it basically collects all the weird words in the book and has their definition right there. So if you're ever like doing something, like you're reading the textbook, you come across a word like, I don't remember what that word means again. It was something we learned about in chapter 2, and this is chapter 17. You can go to the glossary and everything's listed alphabetically, and it's really, really easy to look up the names of words. However, the glossary collects things that are already in the book and puts them in the back to make it easier than looking through the chapters where they were introduced. In these playtest packets, the glossary is where all of these things are introduced, and it's at the end of the book. This is really, really, really bad design. Like, I do not understand, like, I do understand why they keep doing this, because they use the word glossary, and glossaries come at the end of the book, but they don't introduce anything. And again, if you look at the player's handbook, it has a glossary in the back. Or I think it actually has an index. I don't even think it has a glossary, to be honest. But the index kind of provides the same thing without having to reprint material. Effectively, a glossary should be, everything in the glossary should have been explained elsewhere in the book. And yeah, so it annoys the hell out of me that they put new playtest materials and they change definitions between playtests of the exact same thing. They just change the definition of it, but you don't find that out until you read the end of the document. So if you read the document from beginning to end, you will have a completely different idea of what most of these abilities do when you're reading them than when you actually understand how they're supposed to work. Dear Wizards of the Coast, put your goddamn glossary in the front. We can't understand the balance changes for the bard if we don't understand that you've changed how two-weapon fighting works. So, yes, rant over. We're going to be doing this backwards yet again because we have to start with the rules glossary. Now, the feats are not nearly as essential. Well, I guess they are because the epic boons are in there too. Yeah, we're going to do this the same way as the last time, where we're going to literally just go backwards. We're going to start with the rules glossary. The spell lists, I'm not going to go into, but they have more complete spell lists. The spell lists now go all the way up to level 9, which is nice. But I'm not going to go over everything there because I've never, in my D&D deep dive career, I've never done a full deep dive into spells and things like that. Eventually I should, but no, there's a lot of them. But yeah, so we're going to start with the rules glossary. We're going to go through the feats, and then we're going to skip back up to the bard and then go in order. Just because this annoys me so much that I have to do these backwards. Because it would make so much more sense that if you're going to introduce new things, you introduce them before you start using them. Like, again, it doesn't make sense. Anyway, so today we're talking about rules in the September 2022 playtest package. So let's dive into this. So first things first, the first thing they talk about is ability checks. And for the most part, ability checks aren't really that changed from the last playtest packet, and ability checks aren't really changed from the PHB for 5e, except one section where it says action required. Now I'll read it in its entirety because it's super short. Making an ability check requires you to take an action unless a rule says otherwise. Several of the named actions, such as hide and influence, include ability checks. The DM may override this requirement and allow a particular ability check to be made as part of a bonus action or is no action at all. So, to my knowledge, I don't believe in 5th edition it ever outright states any ability check, any skill check, is an action. My understanding has always been effectively, well, the DM gets to decide what's an action, what's not an action as far as skill checks are concerned. Because 9 times out of 10, you don't tend to use too many skill checks in the middle of combat. In 5e, things like stealth checks, you're not technically making a stealth check, you're making the hide action, which involves making a check, but that's really the only check that you ever make. And when that happens, it's always done against passive perception in 5th edition. We'll talk about how they've modified that here. But that's how it's always been, is it's always just been about passive perception. So it wasn't like players were making perception checks to see a hidden enemy or something like that. For the most part, they didn't really happen a ton in combat, and because of that, they didn't really put skill checks into the action economy. Because action economy itself really only matters in combat. Now they have, not only have they defined it that ability checks are always an action, but they have specific actions for different ability checks. Those actions, I might as well talk about them now, because they're going to show up in the rules glossary because it's alphabetical, because that's how glossaries work. And this isn't a glossary. This is how the game runs. Ugh, it still annoys me. But the actual actions are, let me find them. Hidden hide action. So they have the hide action. So the hide action is stealth checks. Then you have the influence action. Basically, all of your charisma checks in order to make a persuasion check or a performance, so they are animal handling, which I guess animal handling has been switched over to charisma. That was not something I was aware of, because I thought animal handling was a wisdom check. But anyway, so it says you make a charisma check, and then animal handling, deception, intimidation, or persuasion. So performance doesn't. That's weird. All right. So anyway, so influence is the action that you use to make an animal handling, deception, intimidation, or persuasion check, and that whole action now has multiple parts to it. There are 3 different aspects of an influence check. You have the attitude of the person or thing you're attempting to influence, which can be indifferent, friendly, or hostile. You have the interactions, which is basically how you are approaching it, which I do like that they mention in here. A lot of DMs that enjoy role playing will, when you're making like a persuasion check, they'll go, well, how are you persuading them? And they kind of force you to role play it out. And I can't remember who it was. It might have been the Jerd when I was talking to him. But one of my other kind of D&D buddies mentioned, well, I don't make rogues actually pick a lock in order to make a thieves' tools check. You know, I don't make monks show me which punch they're doing and see if they're using the correct form or anything like that. Why in the hell am I going to make charisma-based classes have to actually know how to persuade people? Like the player has to actually know how to persuade people. It's not fair. Your character will know things that you don't because you aren't a bard. And so I do like the fact that under the interaction section, they specifically say, when you take the influence action, either roleplay how your character interacts with the creature or describe your character's behavior, focusing on your character's request or demand. If the interaction is especially suited to the creature's desires and outlook, the DM might grant advantage to your subsequent checks, or might temporarily shift a hostile creature to indifferent or an indifferent creature to friendly. Similar, if the interaction is particularly irksome to the creature, the DM might impose disadvantage on your subsequent check, or might temporarily shift a friendly creature to indifferent or an indifferent creature to hostile. So, again, depending on their attitude, the DC for it changes. But they actually have solid DCs. And the DCs themselves are 10 and 20. So they're really easy DCs to memorize. It's either 10 or it's 20. And then effectively, friendly creatures are willing to do more for you on even a DC 10 check than a hostile creature is on a DC 20 check. So I do like the fact that they've added some complexity to the check, which I think is interesting. I'm not as big a fan of just putting down, okay, DC 10, DC 20. Mostly because any character can pass a DC 10 check. Most high-level characters, like once you get to tier 3, most high-level characters can pass a DC 20 check. And will always pass a DC 10 check. There's, when you get into tier 3, DC 10 is basically a gimme check. Bare minimum, if you're playing a tier 3 or tier 4 character, if the DC is under 15, there's no need to roll. They will succeed unless they somehow have a negative modifier in that stat. And most of the time, by the time you're playing a tier 3 character, you know what situations your character needs to avoid. So I'm not particularly fond that they have made these kind of static checks. Just because, again, my first experience DMing was in 4th edition, and they actually had static checks in 4th edition, but they got bigger as the characters got bigger. Now, part of that was because 4th edition, every check you made, you added half your character level to the check. So simply, just from being a level 10 character, you would have a +5 to every roll that you make. That was how 4th edition worked. They had lots of big numbers. So, let's try this again. So in 4th edition, they actually had, if your character, characters level this range, this is an easy check, a medium check, a hard check, a really hard check. And they had that. And then as the characters got to higher levels, the checks got harder. Because again, you still need to challenge, to challenge players. It doesn't mean that locks magically become, become harder to pick as you get to higher and higher levels, or that you never get to the point where, oh, this lock is just super easy. It's just, if you're going to be challenging a player, then you need to have something challenging. And these DCs are for tier 1 or tier 2 players at most. And to be perfectly honest, once you get to tier 2, a DC 20 check in something that you are proficient in generally is not going to be hard. And especially if you start talking about characters with expertise, which is all the classes we'll be talking about in this one, a DC 20s check is child's play. And then again, once you get to tier 3, even without expertise, you're really having no problems regularly getting 20s on your rolls. So yeah, that's my only thing that I'm not particularly fond about. And then obviously it talks about the ability check in the last part, and that's where they put the DCs in. But overall, I like the fact that influence is a little bit more complicated. I like the fact that they specifically state that you don't have to role play it out. You can just say, well, my character is going to focus on this aspect and keep mentioning things like this, and that works just as well as, I've been seeing you walking around town, and couldn't help but notice that your eyes are the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Some people are comfortable doing that, some people aren't. And there's some people that are comfortable role-playing different kinds of interactions. For years and years and years and years, I was not comfortable flirting in any situation whatsoever. I couldn't flirt on stage when I was given words. Like, I couldn't flirt in the script. Like, it just wasn't something that I could do, and it made me extremely uncomfortable. It's probably why I didn't play a ton of romantic leads. In fact, if I think in the entirety of my career, I played one role that would be considered the male romantic lead, and I played it twice. Because I played it in high school, which was horrible. Like, the girl, I was a freshman, the girl was a junior, and Stevie Wonder could have seen that there was nothing between us. Like, she had no love. We never spoke outside of rehearsals. Not even, like, outside of, we would talk, between cuts. And, like, we did not speak to each other unless we had scripts in our hands and the director was directing us to do things. We never spoke to each other. So yeah, that wasn't great. And then a community theater was doing the same show years later, and I auditioned for it, and I auditioned for the same part because it's a really fun part to play. And I got it, and that time the girl was free. Not only was she gorgeous, but she was a brilliant actress. She was super, super fun to work with. I 100% fell for her. Tried asking her out, and I kid you not, after the last thing, I walked her to her car because I thought that was, an appropriate thing to do. And so when she got to her car, I said, "Hey, would you like to get coffee sometime?" Because again, we had been in a show for months and had been because our characters romantically getting linked. We'd been like making out on stage and stuff like that because that's what the show was. But I never so I go, "Hey, do you want to get some coffee sometime?" And her response was, "I don't drink coffee." Which I should have taken as a hint of, "Get out of here, creepazoid." But I didn't. And so my response was that I said, "Well, we don't have to get coffee. We could get any kind of beverage like Slurpees." That's what I said to the girl I'm trying to ask out. I said we could get Slurpees because I thought that was hilarious. Spoiler alert, we never dated. We never went on a date. She has not spoken to me since the day the show closed. And I don't really blame her. I was kind of creepy at that point in my life. So anyway, going back to this. That's I like the changes to that. And I'm actually not against the idea that they've now kind of codified, yes, ability checks are actions. Keeping them out of the action economy meant when you did have players that in the middle of combat wanted to do something a little bit more interesting, they actually had to think about, okay, do I have the action to do that? And that also means as part of your classes, you can now give benefits to classes by saying, how other classes, to make an intimidation check, they have to take an action? You can use it as you can do it as a bonus action or as a reaction or something like that. So I think that's pretty cool. So after the influence action, because that's not the only one, you have the search action. Excuse me for a second. The search action is effectively wisdom checks. So again, they've kind of codified that insight, medicine, perception, and survival are all search actions, and they specifically tell you what you learn from doing that. So insight, the creature's state of mind; medicine, the creature's ailment; perception, concealed creature or object; survival, tracks or food. So now you can take a search action to look for tracks, not traps. That's a different thing. Or you can take a search action to make a perception check. You can use a search action to use a medicine check to see what's got someone sick. But it's an informational action, which I think is interesting. And then you have the study action, which is basically intelligence-based skill checks. So that is Arcana, History, Investigation, Nature, and Religion. None of those have changed from 5e. And it's the cool thing about the study action is it actually not only tells you things like for Arcana will give you information about spells, magic items, eldritch symbols, magical traditions, planes of existence, and certain creatures. And it specifically lists which creatures you would roll an Arcana check to figure out things about them. Like, do I know anything about a beholder? So aberrations, constructs, elementals, fae, and monstrosities are all things that are contained under Arcana checks. History checks, historic events and people, ancient civilizations, wars, and certain creatures, which are giants and humanoids. So if you're trying to figure out something about a humanoid, you would roll a history check. You know, does this humanoid normally have like our trolls, which I think trolls are either giants or humanoids. I can't remember which. I believe I might be wrong. But like our fire giants, weak to cold based at attacks. Well, that would actually be a history check, not like an Arcana check or something like that. Investigation checks, specifically, the first thing that they list is traps. So if you're looking for traps, it is still an investigation check, which I prefer. The reason being, for rogues, specifically, a remarkably common combination for rogues is to have dexterity and either wisdom or intelligence. You generally don't have both. Dex and Wiz gives them a high perception, means it's harder for creatures to sneak up on them. Dex and Intelligence generally was a more magic focused creature. But being able to find traps used to be a perception check effectively. And so wisdom was an extremely important stat for rogues specifically, because rogues generally were the only class for a long time that could disable traps. Artificers eventually got the ability to disable traps as well. But for the most part, it was rogues. And so in order to be a competent rogue, you had to have high dex, because everything rogues do involve dex, and a high wisdom to give you a high enough perception check so you could find the traps before you could disable them. It used to be, I think it was called a spot check, or a search check, depending on the version of D&D you were working with. So yeah, now... and that also meant that wisdom in general was just more useful than intelligence. Unless you were an arcane spellcaster, intelligence really wasn't that useful for most classes. By making investigation, which is the intelligence-based skill, the thing that you use to find traps, that actually gives an intelligence-based character something useful, and it actually kind of tracks. In general, a lot of times if you're finding a trap or something like that, if traps were just always just out in the open and like anybody could figure them out, they wouldn't work. The way that people that are good at noticing traps before they trip them know about them is they understand how traps work. And generally, it's not that you see the trap, it's generally you notice an absence of something that tips you off that, oh, I know that this particular trap can't work when this particular thing is in the way, and I don't see any of those things, and they should be here. Guys, there's probably a trap around. And if I look, okay, I notice that the brush has been cleared away in this particular area, except for this one spot that has got to be a pitfall trap or something like that. So I actually like the idea that you find traps with intelligence rather than perception. Just because, again, you know, if traps stick out like a sore thumb, they don't work. Generally, if you're finding traps, it's more of, oh, wait a minute. You see how that particular, you see how the dust around that particular tile on the floor seems to be just slightly off than the rest of it? Well, that means that that particular tile hasn't been walked on as much. That probably means people are avoiding it. And the reason that people avoid a specific tile is when bad things happen when you step on it. So I like that. Nature is terrain, flora, weather, and certain creatures, which are beasts, dragons, oozes, and plants. And then religion is deities, religious hierarchies and rites, holy symbols, cults, and certain creatures, which are celestials, fiends, and undead. So I do like the fact that the study action has basically codified the idea of, okay, aberrations are more arcana-based, giant knowledge is history-based, undead knowledge is religion-based, despite the fact that a lot of undead are created by arcane magic and not by divine magic, but whatever. So, yeah, overall, I think that's cool. And I think, yeah, and that's the last action. So you have study, you have search, and you have influence, and then obviously the hide action, which hasn't changed. Those are effectively how you make skill checks, and kind of by codifying them, it does allow for a little more manipulation as far as feats are concerned, as far as classes are concerned. Again, the entire point, and I say this over and over and over again, complexity for complexity's sake is not a benefit, it's a detriment. It just makes you do 3 steps to get to the exact same place. It's basically like, instead of walking in a straight line, you walk in a large circle. Well, did the large circle give you any benefit? Not really, you just walked more. And if your goal was to walk more, then yes, you succeeded. But it didn't get you there any faster, it didn't give you any benefit to getting there. That's what complexity for complexity's sake is. It just makes it take longer to do the exact same thing. This could be complexity for complexity's sake. We haven't seen what they're going to do with it. It's like, no, we're just gonna call this a search action instead of, you know, just calling it an insight check or something. Now it's a search action, and a subcategory of search action is insight. So it could just be complexity for complexity's sake. Wizards of the Coast has kind of dove into the idea of, well, if it's more complicated, that makes it better, and that's not how it works. I think there's a lot of potential in this, and I think in a few of the classes they've actually shown, either classes or feats, I can't remember which. They've actually shown that, by the way, this lets you do this particular action as a bonus action. I think that in and of itself is enough to kind of justify the tiny bit of extra complexity that's built into this, by going, well, now we can we've made a default rule, and now that we have a default, we can make exceptions to that, and the exceptions are what the classes or the feats is gonna make them feel special. So yeah, that was ability checks. Moving on. Next thing is armor training. Armor training is the exact same thing as armor proficiency. I don't know why they changed it from proficiency to training, unless they're going to be kind of redefining what proficiency means. But it doesn't really change anything. They talk about Artisan's tools next. It's the exact same thing as the previous playtest, where it's just like Artisan tools are Artisan tools. By the way, they all cost $15 a piece, compared to the PHB, where different Artisan's tools cost different things. Now, everything that's considered an Artisan's tool costs $15, or gold pieces. So yeah, but they do make kind of a minor change to specifically the attack action, which is the attack action itself hasn't changed. When you take the attack action, you can make one attack with a weapon or an unarmed strike. Hasn't changed. However, they now have a new section called Equipping Weapons. You can equip or unequip one weapon before or after any attack you make as part of this action, even if the attack is with an unarmed strike. So, the wording here is not great, because they give you multiple or options without kind of defining if those two separate choices are both mutually exclusive. And what I mean by that is you can equip or unequip. So you can't do both. You can't equip something, attack, and then immediately unequip. You have to either equip it or unequip one weapon. So this only works with one weapon before or after any attack you make as part of this action. So before or after, so you can equip or unequip one weapon, and it has to happen before or after. I guess it makes sense when you read it really, really clearly, but I can see this being a particular thing that people will argue about, especially once you start doing, once you start getting extra attack. People go, well, then I can, because it's an extra attack, I can now equip two different weapons. So the other thing I'm not particularly fond of is using this term equip. You don't equip a sword to attack with it. You draw it. And I liked the term draw because that is a real thing that you do. You store weapons. You generally do not walk around with your weapons in your hands. There's a bunch of different reasons behind this. Probably the biggest of which is you will strain your muscles, which you don't want to do. It's not like weapons are not super heavy. That's another thing we'll talk about in a second here. But the average short sword weighed about 2.5 pounds. The average long sword weighed about 2.5 to 3.5 pounds. They're remarkably light weapons. The average great sword weighed between about 3 and 5 pounds. Great sword, like big Scottish claymore, that 6-foot long blade, that's like a 5-pound weapon. Swords and things like that were not heavy. They could not be heavy because you would wear your muscles out. However, if you were constantly walking around with them in your hands because they are long, in order to keep them pointed in a certain direction, you actually use all the muscles in your forearm. They control your... I can't do that with that hand. So they control your... all your fingers in that. All of that is in your forearm. If you ever want to just feel yourself up, go and do things like this, and you can feel where all the tendons connect way down here, and you can feel each muscle group moving differently in there. Like, it's a really cool thing. But what happens is if you were constantly carrying your weapons in your hands the entire time, just keeping them as your arms are down, to hold them so that they're not just kind of falling out of your hands, you have to grip them and use your two front fingers to pull the edge of the blade up so that it's not pulling everything down, meaning these two fingers and the muscles in here that control them are, right around here that control them, are going to be getting more wear and tear and just are going to be constantly flexed, which means when you do need to use them, those muscles, while it's not a huge amount of weight, those muscles are going to be slightly weaker depending on how long you've been doing it. So every single weapon has something that you keep it in. Blades are kept in sheaths. So the idea that they've gotten away from you can draw or stow and they're calling it equip or unequip, I really don't like, because that's what you do in video games is you equip a weapon or you unequip a weapon. It is a purely video game term. You generally, like, you don't equip armor in combat, you don or doff armor, which is another thing that... Really? Thank you, phone. Yes, that was Power Rangers. Moving on. You don or doff armor, you don't equip it. You draw or stow a weapon, you don't equip it. So I'm not particularly fond with, like, you can now equip or unequip one weapon before or after any attack you make as part of this action, even if the attack is with an unarmed strike. So theoretically, unarmed strikes you can make when you have your weapons, when you have your hands full. It doesn't specifically, like in the playtest material, it says an unarmed strike is a melee attack that involves using your body to damage, grapple, or shove a target within your reach. It doesn't specifically state like it does in the player's handbook. It can be a kick, it can be a headbutt. You know, you can be wielding a weapon and still make an unarmed strike. Like that is perfectly fine. Theoretically, with this new rules to attack, you could make an unarmed strike and equip you could have a sword in your hand, make an unarmed strike, and unequip your sword as part of that unarmed strike, which doesn't make a ton of sense. The thing with drawing a weapon as part of the attack action that is present in 5th edition D&D is because that's an actual thing. In Japanese swordplay, I may be getting this wrong because it's been a while since I've studied this, but I believe it's called Iado was the art of drawing the blade. Specifically with the katana, there's an actual art to attacking as you draw the blade. Like that was an actual focus of combat training for samurai and really anyone that used a katana, which for most of the time the katanas were big in Japan. It was limited to samurai because by law peasants weren't allowed to carry a katana. Only samurai were allowed to wear swords in public. But history aside, that made sense. And it's not even a purely Japanese thing. Like everybody, for the most part, would learn with quite a few different weapons how to attack as part of your drawing. Especially with short-bladed weapons, it was really easy to just and make an attack as you pulled it out. The longer the blade of the weapon, the more difficult it got. That was one of the reasons why it kind of worked with the katana, because the katana was curved, and so it could the act of drawing it out of the socket is the same basic motion you would make to cut with it. Whereas with something like a rapier, it's not a slashing weapon. So in order to attack with it, you have to have it fully out and you have to have the tip so you can thrust. Not that you can't slash with a rapier, it just wasn't built for that. So anyway, this thing about equip and unequip one weapon before or after any attack you make as part of this action is weird, and I don't know why they changed it. Anytime, and I've mentioned this before, anytime you use a different wording in an RPG, the only reason you ever want to use a different wording is if you are doing something different. If you are doing the exact same thing with a different ability, use the exact same wording as before, because then every time there is a change in even just one word, people are going to assume, well, this is supposed to act differently than that one, because if they meant for it to act the exact same way as this other thing, they would have just used the same words. So anytime you change words, it should only be done when you want this to act differently. And so the fact that they're changing it from drawing or stowing a weapon to equipping weapons, They could just be trying to kind of standardize everything from Don, Doff, Stow, and Draw. All those things they want to just go, okay, we're just going to all call that equip. Or it could be that they're going to create a new rule for equipping that doesn't involve drawing or stowing a dagger or something like that, or maybe feats. But with the fact that they're changing the wording, that worries me, because the way that it works currently is perfectly fine. It's not really complicated. It works the way it needs to. And if you start changing things and adding more complexity to it, I don't really see any sort of benefit. Again, it looks like complexity for complexity's sake. So we'll see what happens, but that worries me. Moving on. Slight side note on the next thing, it says attack rolls. They have, and this is a reason why everyone going, oh my god, this is the worst thing to ever happen to D&D. Remember how everyone said that the new critical hit rolls rules were ruining D&D? We are talking a month and a half later. They've gone back to critical hits from the PHB. They have just completely thrown it out. So, no, nothing in this playtest packet is permanent. The massive changes that they did for critical hits, they just threw them away. Now, does that mean that they've gone, nope, we're going to keep critical hits the exact same? No, they could change it again. And to be perfectly honest with just how kind of radical a change the critical hits was, I would be really surprised if they didn't try at least some way of changing how critical hits work, which they do kind of in this. We'll talk about that in a second when we get to the D20 tests. But it none of this stuff is permanent, and we don't have to talk about the end of the world when we see something that's bad. You literally just fill out the survey and go, this is really bad, get rid of it. And if enough people go, this is really bad, get rid of it, without going, you guys are the worst people that have ever lived, and I hope that you burn alive for the entirety of existence. They're people that work a 9-to-5 job. Okay? I cannot vouch for everyone at Wizards of the Coast. There may be some bad people working there. In the same... there are also bad people working in medicine. There are bad people working in the fast food industry. There are bad people working in the plumbing industry. In literally every industry ever, bad people exist. So I'm not saying that everybody at Wizards of the Coast is wonderful. They might be. It is a small enough group that they might just have good people working there. But the idea that because they did something that you don't like in their game, they suddenly deserve death threats or threats of physical violence or insults directed at them personally. No, they're doing a job. And the entire purpose of playtests is to do things that don't work and see if somehow you can make them work. It's the point of playtesting. So stop freaking out. So that's the only change to attack rolls. Moving on. Arcane Spells, the same thing. However, they've changed a couple spells. They introduced, I think it's just 2 spells they have in here. Barkskin and Guidance. They've actually changed how this spell works. And one of them I'm happy about. One of them, I don't think is going to go over super well. But let's talk about the one that shows up alphabetically first. Barkskin. The way Barkskin currently works is it's actually a really, really simple spell. You touch a willing creature until the spell ends. The target's skin has a rough, bark-like appearance, and the target's AC can't be less than 16, regardless of what kind of armor it is wearing. And that's it. And to be perfectly honest, this flavor of Barkskin is mostly useless. An AC of 16 is nice, but it just says the target's AC can't be less than 16. Doesn't mean that your starting AC is 16. Where if you cast Barkskin and then you're wearing like +1 studded leather armor, that doesn't mean that your AC is 19 now. It also doesn't mean that you can go 16 and you have a dexterity of 16, so now your armor class is 19. No. You don't add your dexterity score to that. You don't add anything to it. It's just the minimum your armor class can be is 16, which is not a good armor class even at level 1. A 16 armor class, you're still going to be getting hit more than you're going to be missed. Because this is a second level spell, you don't get access to it until 3rd level. So it's not that useful a spell. Now, the new version. Here's a new version of the Barkskin spell. 2nd level transmutation, primal spell. Casting time bonus action. It is also an action to cast it in 5th edition. So they've gone from action to bonus action. I'm okay with that. Components, verbal, somatic, material. Handful of bark is the material component. None of that is consumed. So this is something that can... the material component can be replaced by a spellcasting focus. Duration, concentration, up to an hour. That's fine. You touch one willing creature to protect it with regenerating bark. Until the spell ends, the target's skin assumes a bark-like appearance. And at the start of each of the target's turns, the target gains a number of temporary hit points equal to your spellcasting ability modifier plus your proficiency bonus. And then at higher levels, when you cast it using a spell slot of 3rd level or higher, you can target one additional willing creature for each slot above 2nd. So Barkskin has changed from we're going to just give you an AC of 16, which isn't that useful even when you get it, and becomes useless once you hit tier 2, to we're giving you regenerating temp hit points, which just so happen to increase as you gain levels. Everything about this is cool. First things first, spellcasting ability modifier plus proficiency bonus means at max level, you're getting 11 temporary hit points per turn. Now, for those of you that don't understand temporary hit points sit on top of your hit points. And whenever you take damage, temporary hit points always drain first. They go away after a short or long rest. And probably the most important part, they don't stack. So if you get 11 temporary hit points this turn, and then next turn you get 11 temporary hit points, you have 11 temporary hit points. Now, if you got 6 temporary hit points this turn, and then next turn something else happens to you and you get 11 temporary hit points, you get 11 temporary hit points. Whatever the highest amount of hit points, temp hit points you get, that's how many temp hit points you have. They don't stack. Different abilities that both give temporary hit points, don't add them together. Temporary hit points is whatever your largest increase to your temp HP, that's what you have. But that being said, this lasts for an hour, and that means every time you take damage, you are effectively reducing it by... When you get this ability at 2nd level, you more likely than not have a 16 in your main spellcasting thing, so that's 3. And then proficiency bonus at the 3rd level, I believe is 2. I don't think it gets to 3 until 5th level. Before I say the wrong thing, I'm going to actually look it up. Yes, proficiency bonus gets to 3. So 3 plus 2 at the 3rd level is 5. So you get 5 temporary hit points, which at level 3 is a nice cushion, and it comes back every turn. So this is not like you only ever get 5 hit points. It means every turn you are reducing the damage that you get by 5. It actually kind of reminds me of something from 4th edition. Again, the dreaded 4th edition that keeps showing up in 1D&D, folks. It's a lot better than a lot of people thought. Which is the resistance and vulnerability things from 4th edition were interesting. To be perfectly honest, I think they're more interesting than the 5th edition. They're also a lot more complicated. So I'm not really opposed to the simplicity of the 5th edition one. I don't think they used, especially vulnerability. They almost never used vulnerability in 5th edition, whereas resistance and vulnerability in 4th edition, it was everywhere. But basically, the way that resistance and vulnerability worked in 4th edition was you would get resist and then a number and then a damage type. So you would get resist 5 fire, would mean anytime you take fire damage, you would take 5 points of damage off of it before you took any damage. That's what resist 5 meant. So that means if you had resist 5 fire and you got hit by an attack that did 10 fire damage, you would, before even factoring in anything else, any abilities, any reactions, whatever, you would reduce it down and you'd only take 5 fire damage. And it could add up, like different resistances might increase your fire resistance or something like that. And it was interesting. Vulnerability was the same thing. You were vulnerable 10 cold. Meant that anytime you took cold damage, you added 10 to it. It was both relatively simple and relatively complex in the fact that understanding what it did was super, super simple. Resist 5 fire. I know what that means. Every single time I get fire damage, I take off 5 from it. Vulnerable 5 cold. Every single time I take cold damage, I take an additional 5 points of damage. However, balancing that became a bit of a weird thing. But it did mean in 4th edition, resistance and vulnerabilities were actually important. Whereas in 5th edition, for the most part, the only time you ever deal with resistance is if you're a barbarian or if you have a spell cast on you that gives you resistance to a certain type of damage, and you never deal with vulnerability. I think there's like a dozen creatures in the entirety of the monster manual and all the other supplements that actually have a vulnerability to a damage type, because resistance means you half it, vulnerability means you double it, and doubling is a huge benefit. And so to avoid, because in the playtest, like skeletons used to be vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, which is historically accurate as far as D&D is concerned. And so monks could absolutely wipe the floor with skeletons because all of their attacks were bludgeoning. So they would do double damage on every single attack. And there's one adventure that I ran where you were just fighting a bunch of skeletons. So yeah, it was super like playing a monk. I could just wipe the floor, just a pop, 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 and I was killing everything. And then you'd have like a warrior with a great axe trying to attack, and I think they were resistant to slashing weapons, so they were trying to attack this, and they were doing no damage, and I was just going around flicking them in the nose and killing everything. So anyway, back to Barkskin. That kind of has that feel. The big difference is this is not every time you get attacked, you take 5 off. It's every turn you get your 10 hit points. If you're only hit 1 per turn, that's every attack you're getting this little buffer of hit points. However, even if you're getting attacked multiple times per turn, the longer combat goes on, the more effective Barkskin becomes, depending on how many times you're hit. Because again, every turn you get those 10 hit points back. And even at level 20, where 11 hit points isn't going to stop a single attack, it's still something. And when you're talking about action economy and what's getting the most kind of bang for your buck as far as your attack actions, the fact that every creature you attack, or every different creature the enemy attacks per turn that has Barkskin on, they're effectively regenerating hit points every turn, means the hit point pool for the other side is getting bigger every turn. Now, it may not be getting objectively bigger. Like, let's say on every character has 50 hit points, to use easy numbers, and there's 4 people on the team. Okay, so that side has 200 hit points, and let's say the monsters have 200 hit points, and both sides attack and do 20 hit points of damage spread about around them. If you look and this side gets 5 hit points each every battle, every turn, the next turn, while this side only has 80 hit points, this side let's say they did 25 points of damage just so it works. So this side only has 75 hit points. This side has 95 hit points. So are they over 100 hit points? No, but because of that little bit of regen, they're now in a more beneficial position than they were the turn before. And every turn after that, it gets better and better and better. It also means that because bad guys should be able to use this spell too, it means it starts becoming more advantageous to focus fire when multiple characters have Barkskin on. Just because once that hit point pool is gone, then all the rest of the damage that you take is just extra damage. So it changes the game, I think, in a good way. And it actually makes the Barkskin spell useful. And earlier iterations of the Barkskin spell actually were useful. The 5th edition version just sucked. So, yes, that is Barkskin. Moving on. The next talk about Blindsight. Nothing changes. Climb speed, nothing changes. Creature type, nothing changes. D20 chest, slight change. Again, I mentioned that they threw away the critical hit rules. Well, they didn't throw them completely away. They changed one thing. It used to be anytime you rolled a nat 20, you also got inspiration, which they're now calling heroic inspiration, which is nice because before there was inspiration and then there was bardic inspiration, and they were two massively different things. Inspiration, which we just got to calling DM inspiration, lets you get advantage on an attack roll or on an attack roll ability check or saving throw. Bardic inspiration gave you an additional die you got to roll. So it was a completely different thing, but they used the same word, which I hated. Now they call it heroic inspiration. But what they've changed, instead of every time you roll a nat 20, you get an inspiration. Now, whenever a player character rolls a nat 1 for a D20 test, they gain heroic inspiration. So now it's tied to crit fails effectively. And I'm not really against that. I think, especially if you're talking about like old school D&D people, especially if you do things like people that play Pathfinder, or the people that still play 3rd edition, they have this strange thing where nat 1s need to be some kind of punishment for the player. Like, you really have to make a player feel extra bad for rolling a nat 1. It's not just that you failed the roll. You also attacked your friend, or you chopped off your own arm. And I've always said, like, I do not use fumble tables. I will never use fumble tables, because the idea that somebody whose very life depends on their ability to defend themselves with a sword does not hit themselves 1 out of every 20 times they swing the weapon. When I was doing weapon training, I trained in Kabutosai, nunchucks, and katana. Those are the 3 weapons that I trained in various things. I was never very good at the sai. Nunchucks, I got passable at 1. I was never able to learn double nunchucks, which is a completely different skill set, by the way. Oh, and I also used to do staff. But katana I got really good with. If I ever had a light workout with my katana where I only swung it 20 times, that doesn't even count as a workout. That doesn't even count as practice. That was me just, oh, my katana's here while I'm going to put it away. And I never used an actual katana. I used a boken, which is a wooden katana. Oh, my boken's here. While I'm putting it away, I'm going to take a couple swings as I look for where I'm supposed to put it. Like, the idea that somehow people that base whether or not they live or die on how good they are with a sword is somehow going to hit themselves with the sword 1 out of every 20 times they swing it, or they're going to hit their allies. No, that person wouldn't make it to level 1. They would die before they went on their first adventure, and no one would adventure with them. So the idea that somehow you need to punish players for something that they have absolutely no control over, I have never understood. To me, it is just a vindictive thing that that some DMs do just, again, so that they can feel powerful. It's like, yo, you got a natural 1. I shall roll on my fumble table and, oh, You no longer have that arm! Mwahahaha! Your entire character is a joke. Congratulations because of one fucking roll. It's always been stupid to me. Combine that with the fact that we're not talking about how bad I am at rolling, by the way. I am remarkably good at fucking things up. Like, if I could get paid to screw things up, I would be a billionaire. I mean, maybe I should start thinking about a career in politics, because it seems like that's all they do there, but political commentary aside, I screw up constantly. And one of my rules of training that I've come up with, again, Trainer Jody is not a Pokemon term. I am an actual trainer. At least I was when I could work. It's what I did. That's what I specialized in. I'm very, very good at it. One of the most important aspects of training in general is to create an environment where your trainees feel safe in failure. Failure is a significantly better teacher than success ever will be. So having a character royally fail and get inspiration because of it actually makes more sense than doing something really well and getting some type of reward for it. Success generally breeds pride and ego, which is always a detriment to anything that you do. As soon as you get proud, as soon as you think your shit doesn't stink, you start cutting corners because you are special and therefore don't have to follow the other rules that other people do. And that's when really bad things happen. But failure, most people will react one of two ways. One, failure, they take it personally. I am a failure, and they never do the thing again, which is basically what fumble tables are effectively supposed to do. Is they're designed to punish you for something you had no control over. Or, and this tends to be more common, despite the fact that you won't hear about it as much, when someone screws up, they will try extra hard the next time to not screw up. And even people that are bad at training themselves learn this intrinsically. Like, this is not something you need to teach absolutely every person. It's something that you need to teach people to do all the time. But everybody does this in some situations. The thing that makes someone a good self-trainer, and the thing that makes someone a good trainer in general, is the idea is they can teach people to do it all the time. Every time you fail, you use it as a learning experience instead of some of the times you fail, I'll learn from this, and other times I'm a worthless, disgusting person that deserves to die. So I like that. I think it's cool. I think it's interesting, and it takes a little bit of this thing. Again, rolling nat ones already sucks. A buddy of mine just introduced, I think, 5 people to D&D for the first time. And none of them had ever played before. They were having an absolute blast. They're doing the 5e version of Saltmarsh. And they get into a fight with just a shit ton of bullywugs. Like, I'm not kidding. Throughout the fight, I think they fought... it had to be 10 to 12 bullywugs, and it's a 5-person party. The thing that made it not massively unbalanced is that the bullywugs come in waves. Combat was taking forever. And the reason why is they kept missing. They were low-level characters. They were new players that didn't quite understand the game super well, and so that made combat take a little bit longer because they didn't know what they needed to do every turn. But I'm not kidding. There was like 2 or 3 turns where no one hit. And I don't mean like none of the players hit. Nobody hit. And it wasn't because it was an unbalanced combat or anything. Like, the bullywugs had armor class, I think, like 14 or 15, which is exactly what you would expect for, and I think at this point in the game, they were level 3 characters. Yeah, they were level 3 characters. So 14 to 15 armor class, that's exactly what level 3 characters should be going against. And it wasn't that the players had massively armor classes either. They just all were rolling like for like a full round. Nobody rolled over a 4. And it gets frustrating, and the players weren't enjoying themselves. And the DM, who's a great DM, he was just a little bit rusty, and I don't believe he'd ever run for an entirely brand new group, or if he had, it had been a very long time. And so he was a little rusty, and he was trying to keep things moving, and he was trying to keep people having fun. There are ways to make combat enjoyable even when everyone is missing, but it's not something for a rusty DM. It's not something that I'm expecting a rusty DM to do, because it takes a lot of performance ability and stuff like that. So the DM was doing great and doing everything that he could, but combat was not fun. And so things like this, giving anytime they roll a nat 1, they get heroic inspiration. I'm okay with that. I think it's good. I really would like them to get rid of the term inspiration for this particular mechanic. There's already a thing called inspiration. It's bardic inspiration. When people say inspiration, they think of bardic inspiration, because nobody used DM inspiration or now heroic inspiration that much. Call it a hero point. Call it anything else. Just don't call it inspiration anymore. It's just confusing. Again, word choice is super, super important. And when you have two things that use the exact same word, just one of them has a word modifying it, but they refer to two completely separate ideas that are in no way related whatsoever, it causes confusion. So, anyway, that's the one change to D20 tests. Moving on. They talk about dash action. They talk about difficult terrain. Again, none of that stuff is different. Divine spells. Again, none of that stuff is different. However, the next section is the exhausted condition. In 5th edition, exhaustion is horrible. The exhausted condition is a really, really, really bad thing to get hit with. One level of exhaustion gives you disadvantage on all skill checks, and I think it's skill checks and saving throws. You know what? I have the damn D&D Beyond open. You know what I could do is I could actually look up how exhaustion works. Conditions. E for exhaustion. So, level 1 exhaustion in current D&D is disadvantage on ability checks. So that's not saving throws or anything like that. Just ability checks. Second level, your speed is halved. Again, a lot of people undervalue how much of a change additional speed is, mostly because they don't play monks. Additional speed can be a huge game changer. However, everybody hates half speed because it really sucks. Most characters have a 30-foot speed, and that's generally enough to do anything you want in the battlefield. 15-foot speed, you can't do shit. It just sucks. So once you get to 2 levels of exhaustion, things start feeling real bad. Once you get to the 3rd level of exhaustion, you have disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws. That is a huge, huge issue. Disadvantage on attack rolls means rogues can't crit anymore. And saving throws means you're taking a lot more damage. 4 levels of exhaustion, your hit point maximum is halved. That's a big deal. 5 levels of exhaustion, your speed is reduced to 0. You are effectively dead. You are a brain in a jar at that point that will fail a lot more than they succeed. And 6th level, you're dead. You're just dead. There's no roll you make. If you get to 6 levels of exhaustion, you just die. It is really, really powerful. And to be perfectly honest, it is the only kind of persistent condition in D&D that doesn't have a really simple fix for it. Poison is super easy to get rid of. Paralysis doesn't last very long. Everything, like, there's tons of different ways to get rid of every single condition, but exhaustion, the only way to get rid of it for most characters is you have to take a long rest. And all a long rest does is remove 1 level of exhaustion. Whereas Um, anything else, generally a long rest is going to get rid of this. And then you also have Greater Restoration, which will also remove 1 level of exhaustion. So exhaustion is a really, really big deal in 5th edition. And anything that gives exhaustion is meant to seem really, really powerful. Because of that, nothing gives you exhaustion. Nothing. There's so few abilities. Like, there's a few high-level monsters that will give out levels of exhaustion, but because it is so debilitating and getting 6 levels means insta-die, they cannot give you... they cannot make it stack too quickly. And because it's so difficult to get rid of, if there was just a regular creature that could inflict, maybe 1 or 2 levels of exhaustion per combat, because of saves and everything like that, you're generally only inflicting 1 or 2 levels. That would mean if you fought that creature 3 times in a day, which is not a really strange thing to happen in a dungeon delve, there was a good chance you would be killing quite a few players from 3 relatively normal creatures. So exhaustion, while yes, it's really powerful, because it's so powerful, no one ever uses it because it's so easy for things to break. Exhaustion in 1 D&D is very, very different. First, levels of exhaustion. Condition is cumulative. Each time you receive it, you gain 1 level of exhaustion. You die if your exhaustion level exceeds 10. So, some words we want to focus on. You die if your exhaustion level exceeds 10. So you don't die when you hit 10 exhaustion. You die when you hit 11 exhaustion, effectively. It has to exceed 10. So that's the first thing. You have 10 levels of exhaustion instead of 6. So because there are more levels before you die, it can be inflicted more often without too many difficulties. Now, they haven't really said... or they do have here, it's still going to be hard to get rid of, but just the extra level is going to be nice. What does it do? Well, D20 rolls affected. When you make a D20 test, you subtract your exhaustion level from the D20 roll. Exhaustion is effectively a negative modifier for your for all of your D20 rolls. Attack rolls, everything. You just get a level 1 exhaustion, you get a -1 to attack rolls, -2. Floating... What I refer to as floating modifiers are a thing that they got rid of in 5th edition, and rightfully so. Floating modifiers are a pain in the ass. Talk about not even high-level combat in 3rd edition, mid-level combat in 3rd edition. You could have 2 or 3 different floating modifiers on a single attack roll that change every turn depending on where the creature is, what the creature is next to, where you are. Like, it was really, really confusing. And depending on which rules you were using, you would have different floating modifiers. The exhausted condition, I don't consider a floating modifier, because the thing that makes it floating is that it's not in any one spot. It floats, and so it can change its position because it's floating. This is technically, once you get the level of exhaustion, you can write that down on your character sheet, and all of your rolls now get a -1. So it's not like every round of combat is going to change, or depending on the enemy is going to be changed, but it still is a negative modifier. And 5th edition has strayed away from positive and negative modifiers as much as they can. Really, the only numerical modifiers they've put in 5th edition have been partial cover, 3/4 and 3/4 cover, which partial cover gives you +2 to your AC, 3/4 gives you a +5. That is the only time they really put numerical modifiers. Everything else is based on advantage, disadvantage. And I like that. It made it significantly easier to run things. And I think it made it easier for players to understand things as well. So that I don't think is bad. So levels of exhaustion now, your D20 rolls are affected, spell save DCs are affected. So specifically, subtract your exhaustion level from the spell save DC of any spell you cast. So it's not even just, well, I cast spells, so I don't make attack rolls or tests. They do. Well, this also makes it easier for people to save from your spells. So exhaustion is a big deal. Ending the condition, finishing a long rest removes 1 of your levels of exhaustion. When your exhaustion level reaches 0, you no longer exhaustion. exhausted. So again, long rest only gets 1. However, it's both better and worse than the previous version of exhaustion. What I mean by that is, because you can get 10 of them without dying, that means DMs can be a little bit more liberal in giving levels of exhaustion. And because it's only a -1 instead of disadvantage on things, or having your speed or having your hit points, all it affects is your rolls. It's not quite as impactful as the old version of exhaustion. However, because you can get a lot more levels of exhaustion, that means you also have to spend a lot longer getting rid of it. So I would hope that at least like maybe lesser restoration now removes a single level of exhaustion, or maybe greater restoration removes multiple levels of exhaustion. Just something, or maybe if you upcast greater restoration, you can remove multiple levels or something. Just because with how many more levels of exhaustion you can get, this could become really annoying really quickly for some players, especially like Frenzy Barbarians. Or Berserker Barbarians, like in Frenzy. The current rules for Barbarians is if you go into a Frenzy, you get a level of exhaustion. 6th edition, or in 5th edition, that's a pretty big thing. With this, it wouldn't be nearly as bad, but if they are regularly going into Frenzies, which they should be, that's a part of their subclass. It will add up really, really quickly, and then it'll effectively turn into, well, the Barbarian is always exhausted. And that wouldn't be very fun. So I'm interested to see where it goes. I think I like this version of exhaustion better than the current version of exhaustion. But with the additional levels, I think they need another way to get rid of exhaustion other than 1 level per long rest. I think that's going to turn it into everybody's just exhausted all the time, and it's not fun. Moving on. And talk about expertise. It works the same way it always had. Fly speed, gaming set. The grappled condition is the same as the grappled condition from the other playtest, which again I like the grappled condition. How it's changed. It's basically kind of a combination between grappled and restrained now. So it's actually useful. And then we get to guidance. Guidance is a cantrip, which they're now calling cantrip 0-level spells, and I hate that. I think it's the dumbest thing in the world. I know that's what cantrips used to be called, but it's stupid. Call them cantrips. A 0-level spell just sounds dumb. You don't have a 0-level of a building. You have the ground floor. I hate the term 0-level spell. Cantrip worked perfectly fine. So guidance, they have changed. The way guidance used to work before, and this one I actually have to remember. Come on, guidance. Did I spell it right? I did! So, guidance used to be an action. And basically you touch a creature. Once before the spell ends, the target can roll a d4 and add the number rolled to one ability check of its choice. It can roll the die before or after making the ability check, then the spell ends. That's what it used to be. The new version of guidance is a reaction. So it is no longer part of your turn action economy. It is now a reaction. And you take it in response to you or an ally within 30 feet of you failing an ability check. So I've mentioned this before. Having something that you have to choose before you roll versus have to choose after you roll is a huge, huge difference. Because if you choose before you roll, there's always a chance that you're going to waste it. And the way guidance worked before is it wasn't even you had to do it before the roll. You had to do it on a character that was going to roll. So theoretically, not only did you have to know which roll was going to be important to use guidance on, you had to know which character was going to make that roll. So guidance in itself could be wasted. However, because it just took an action and 9 times out of 10 it was used outside of combat, guidance was abused like hell. I had quite a few situations when I was in AL, Adventurers League, did a DM, where in the middle of like a negotiation with an NPC, one of the players would be like, I'm going to try and do this. I go, okay, make a persuasion check. And the cleric goes, I cast guidance on them. I go, okay. And they cast and roll. And I said, well, and they roll like a 26. I go, unfortunately, you failed. I go, how do I fail the 26? The person right next to you literally just touched you on the shoulder and said, please, God, help this person lie. He said, I didn't do that. I said, the spell is verbal and somatic. You have to touch them. And it's a cantrip. Everybody is going to recognize that you're casting a spell. And so what the NPC just saw was this person was saying something that they weren't sure they were going to believe. And then they watched as their divine-oriented friend touched them on the shoulder, said magic words, and they suddenly seem more convincing. No, the person doesn't believe you even if what you were saying was true because they just watched someone pray, please God help me lie. So that was kind of the only limitation to it, was I would go, okay, but it is a spell that has verbal and somatic components. If you cast it around other people, they're going to know you're casting the spell. So if you want to help your friend, that's perfectly fine. But if you're doing it in a situation where your friend is doing something dishonest or just doing something that would look weird that someone else is trying to help them do it, then you're going to run into problems. So now it is a reaction that happens when they fail an ability check. And this is specifically ability checks, so it doesn't work on attack rolls, which I have to look real quick if it worked. On one ability check of choice. So yeah, it didn't work on attack rolls, just ability checks before. And it's a 30-foot range. It's no longer a touch-based spell. So that kind of makes things interesting. But this is what gets it weird. So you channel magical insight to the creature who failed the ability check. That creature can roll a d4 and add the number rolled to the check, potentially turning it into a success. Once a creature rolls the die for this spell, that creature can't benefit from the spell again until the creature finishes a long rest. So the thing with guidance is there really weren't that many situations where guidance was inappropriate. Like I said, if you're trying to lie and you give someone guidance to help them lie, that's going to make you fail the check. But other than specific instances like that, where divine help would be seen as something that you shouldn't do, other than that specific situation, guidance is always a good idea. If your cleric or whoever has the guidance cantrip is not actively doing something, it is always in their best interest to cast guidance before any ability check. It is always good. It was a concentration spell before, so you couldn't have multiple people guided at the same time. But as soon as they made their check and added the die to it, they didn't need it anymore. And it only lasted for a minute, so it wasn't like you were prepping it before combat or something. So guidance just got spammed everywhere. Now it's a reaction, so it's better in the idea that it's better in the I'm going to try this one more time. It's better in the idea that it's never really going to be quote unquote wasted. It may sometimes be the situation where the DC is a 15 and you rolled a 2. And so even with guidance, you can't get to it. But it's never going to be, oh, here's guidance. Oh, I rolled a nat 20. I guess you just wasted your guidance. For a cantrip, you can't really quote unquote waste it. But this does mean that every time it's being used, because it only is used when you fail an ability check, you're going to be able to use it. However, limiting it to once per long rest means it is significant, especially since it's still just a D4. If it was a D6 or a D8, I probably would be a little bit better with it being once per long rest. with it being a DU4, it doesn't even feel worth it. Even as a cantrip, it doesn't feel worth it. And again, changing it to a reaction and changing it to a range instead of a touch-based spell, yeah, that does mean that without some sort of limitation, it's even easier to exploit than it was before. This just feels like an overcorrection, to say the least. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the new version of guidance. Again, I know a lot of DMs that hate guidance. I was not one of them. Like I said, the only time I would cause issues at my table was when a cleric would be like, well, I will just guidance everything. Guidance, 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 guidance. And then they would get upset and it's like, yeah, some people don't like it when you ask God to help you lie or you ask God to help somebody steal something. Like anytime you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing and you pray to God to help you or someone else do it loudly like a Pharisee, yeah, people are going to have problems with that and you're going to get a name made for yourself that, oh, that's the cleric that likes to cheat and no one will take you seriously anymore. That to me is a perfectly valid way to limit the ability of guidance from just being guidance, 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 like Hercules, Hercules, guidance, guidance, guidance. So I can see this as they're trying to stop the trigger happy clerics that just, oh, I guidance you. Oh, I guidance you. Remember, I guidance you. I've actually had a few that at the beginning of an Adventurers League session would just go, by the way, I know the guidance cantrip. Anytime somebody makes an ability check, just assume I'm casting guidance. Which again would always result in, well, you said you always cast guidance, right? Well, yeah. Well, you just ask God to help him steal in front of the shopkeeper. So they called the guards on you. But that's not what I meant. Well, maybe you need to actually think about playing your character instead of, oh, I'm just going to turn on my buff ability so that everybody gets the buff. Like the video games. So anyway, that's the new version of guidance. Moving on. The help action, really not changed. Heroic Inspiration, other than you get it from a nat 1. The other thing that's kind of different, simply because it wasn't technically explicitly stated, but it had been ruled. The way DM Inspiration works in 5th edition is you can give yourself advantage on one attack roll, ability check, or saving throw. Once you roll it, you have already made the roll. So in order to use Inspiration, you have to choose before you do it, because Inspiration was not a re-roll. It was, if I need to do this, I'm going to use my Inspiration and try extra hard on it. Now they specifically say, when you have Heroic Inspiration, also called Inspiration, Burn in Hell, you can expend it to give yourself advantage on a D20 test. You decide to do so immediately. You decide to do so immediately after rolling the D20. So Inspiration, you actually never use before you roll. So there's no chance that you can, waste it, quote unquote. And I'm not 100% against that either. Again, I liked the ruling the way it was, but having used it, and again, with how often people don't use it, it works better this way. And then obviously you get Inspiration from rolling a 1 on a D20 test. The only other thing that I'm not really fond of Heroic Inspiration is the only one at a time thing. Again, I understand the idea behind it because you can't have double advantage. That being said, I really think players need to be able to store up some Inspiration. Because again, what invariably happens is when you only have one of a thing, it becomes super, super special and precious, and I can't use it unless it's the exact right time. When you have even just 2 instead of 1, you're able to use it more, and it also means that DMs can reward it more often. Because there's a lot of rolling in D&D 5th edition. it is a very roll heavy game, and it's designed around the fact that you're going to be making a lot of rolls. A lot of the rules and things like that in 5th edition don't actually work if you have less rolls that you have to make. Like, if they reduced everyone's hit points so that in general you were only attacking to attack most creatures, you only had to hit them maybe once or twice, a lot of abilities across all classes become next to useless because they're designed around the fact that you have to make multiple rolls to do something. So because of that, you're going to be rolling a lot. Being able to, like, maybe you can store up an amount equal to your proficiency bonus. Like, I'm perfectly fine with having, low-level characters having 2, 3, or 4 inspiration kind of pooled up, and then they just use it on, like, 3 or 4 subsequent rolls. I think that's perfectly fine. But when this only one at a time thing just doesn't feel good to me, and it has never worked. I think that's one of the reasons why nobody uses it, because DMs giving out inspiration, they can't give it out too much, because if the players don't use it, then giving out DM inspiration doesn't work. Because, like, I'm going to give you DM inspiration or heroic inspiration now. Oh, I already have it. Well, then you've just wasted this. It seems like a punishment, so that's my 2 cents. Moving on. Another 2-hour video. This one might not be 2 hours, but it's getting close. Actually, it's an hour and a half right now, but the next thing, the hidden condition. This is a massive change that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about. I'm not sure if they just don't understand how hiding works currently, because a lot of people have no idea how to hide in 5th edition D&D. Or that people were worried about, just how much they changed the bard and things like that. But the hidden condition and the hide action have changed pretty significantly. The hidden condition, I guess, isn't really that changed. When you're hidden, you experience the following effects. You are concealed. You aren't affected by any effect that requires its target to be seen. So if something says, if you see, like counterspell, if you see someone casting a spell, you can counterspell it. If they can't see you, they can't counterspell you. So that is a really DM tip. If you have an enemy that is counterspelling you constantly, make it so they can't see you. Hide behind a rock. Aim for something. Like, if you're aiming at them and they're constantly counterspelling you, okay, hide behind a rock and aim at something that's not them, but has an area effect that will still affect them. So they can't see you, and you can see where you need to hit. I've seen people do this in games, and one DM literally rewrote the laws of physics because there was a picture on the wall that was counterspelling us, and counterspell has, I believe it's a 30-foot range. It's either 30 or 60 feet. Whatever the range was, the player counted out the squares and stood 5 feet outside of the counterspell range, cast a spell, and the guy goes, he counterspells you. And the player goes, no, he doesn't. And the DM's like, what did you say? I am the mighty DM. You shall never argue with me. He didn't, but he just looked at him like, what are you talking about? You can't say that. He says, no, counterspell has a limited range. I'm outside the range. And he looks, and he's right. He's like, well, I drew the map wrong then. There's nowhere in this cave that the painting can't counterspell you. You have to kill the painting. And the player got justifiably pissed. Now, this was the same DM that gave Vampire Spawn magical dark vision just because I was playing a Shadow Monk and I cast Darkness. So, because these Vampire Spawns had Spider Climb and were on the roof attacking us, and we couldn't attack them back. And we were just getting killed. So I said, you know what? It's better for them to at least have disadvantage, and if they can't see us, they can't make opportunity attacks, so we can run and barricade ourselves and get to a better position. So I cast the Darkness spell, and despite the fact that I can't see, I can still follow the wall and move away. Didn't work. The Vampire Spawn magically had dark vision, and I got like 4 opportunity attacks and got knocked unconscious because I ran past all of them, being a monk. So I'm like, but they don't, like, I know, like, not trying to metagame here, but when have Vampire Spawn been able to see in magical darkness? Well, I'm just making the encounter more, more challenging. I said it was already challenging. You're not allowed to change the rules in an Adventures League game. That means that this is not an Adventures League legal campaign, and I'm not going to play in it. So yeah, like, again, this was the same guy that's like, well, I drew the map wrong, so you still have to deal with this. So he wasn't a fantastic DM. Anyway, so the hidden condition. You aren't affected by anything that requires the target to be seen. Surprise, if you're hidden when you roll initiative, you have advantage in the roll. That's kind of a new thing. Attacks effective. Attack rolls have against you have disadvantage, and your attack rolls have advantage. And ending the condition. And this is, again, something that's kind of been understood and I think has been ruled, but has never been codified in the language, which is the condition ends on you immediately after any of the following occurrences. You make a sound louder than a whisper. So anytime you do something louder than a whisper, you are instantly unhidden. An enemy finds you. So if any enemy finds you, you're instantly unhidden. You make an attack roll. So any attack roll, instantly unhidden. You cast a spell with a verbal component. So even if you try to whisper a spell, if you cast a spell with a verbal component, instantly no longer hidden. Or you aren't heavily obscured or behind any cover. And this is the one where a lot of rogues in early 5th edition, in like the first couple seasons of the Adventures League, this is where they would argue with the DM, because they would go, well, I'm hidden. I go, okay, you're hidden. Then they go, okay, I'm going to run out and I'm going to get sneak attack on this guy. I said, you can't get sneak attack and none of your allies are next to him. But I'm hidden, so I get advantage. No, you don't. But you said I'm hidden. Yes, over here. But you just ran out of cover. You're no longer hidden. The second you come out of cover, you're not hidden anymore. People know that you're there. Well, can I roll a stealth check to see if he doesn't recognize me? It's the middle of combat and he's hyper focused on the people trying to kill him. And oh, by the way, he saw you run back there. No. Now it has been codified. If an enemy finds you, if you aren't heavily obscured or behind any cover, you are instantly no longer hidden and none of the benefits happen. The hide action is where things get weird. With the hide action, you try to conceal yourself. To do so, you must make a DC 15 dexterity check, stealth, while you're heavily obscured or behind 3/4 cover or total cover. And you must be out of any visible enemy's line of sight. If you can see a creature, you can discern whether it can see you. So the thing about 3/4 cover is 3/4 cover does not break line of sight. Only total cover or heavily obscured does that. So you can make a stealth check while you're behind 3/4 cover, but any visible enemy's line of sight means you cannot take the hide action. So 3/4 cover is not enough for you to be able to hide. And then the other thing that changes is, again, the hide action used to be, it would be against enemies' passive perception. So if you had a particularly perceptive creature with like a 22, you'd have to roll pretty high. It also meant that you might be hidden to some enemies and not to others. With the new rules, if any enemy can see you, all the enemies can see you, which I think makes perfect sense. Because, again, it's pretty easy to go, there's a dude over there! Or I guess in this one, there's a dude over there! Fireball! So that makes sense to me. But now it's just a flat DC 15 dexterity check, stealth, which again, for a rogue with expertise in stealth, bare minimum, they're probably going to have, once they get expertise, they're going to have a bare minimum +9 to their stealth check. So they only have to roll a 6 or higher to become invisible. And it just, once they get up to an 18, that means they only need a 5. Literally, it only takes about to level 10 to where rogues never fail stealth checks. And anyone with expertise in stealth never fails. They were always, and there's nothing you can do about it, because you can't add enemies that just have high wisdom scores that are good at spotting hidden players to give your players a challenge. No, this is a get out of sight free card. And I'm not, again, anytime they add a hard and fast number, generally it's always going to benefit the players, because the players are going to get more powerful, and a hard and fast number is either going to be too high for a low level player, or it's going to be too low for a mid to high level player. And every check that they've done in here has been something that low level players can succeed on a fairly regular basis. So that means once they get to tier 2 or tier 3, they're never failing. And at that point, why make the check? You know, again, just go, well, I'm hidden. There's nothing you can do about it. It seems pointless. So not a huge fan of the change to hide. The rest of it I'm perfectly fine with, but make it passive perception again. And it also means that you have to actually beat whichever creature has the highest passive perception to hide from any of them, which I think is perfectly fair. Again, rogues are this close to being broken, or they are in 5th edition. We'll talk about them in here. But they are this close to being broken. Because of expertise and because of all the other shit that they get, they are extremely powerful characters compared to a lot of other classes. So I don't think they need the ability to instantly turn themselves invisible all the time. I don't think they need advantage on every single attack roll. I think there should be limitations because there's so many other things that they can do well. They don't need to be able to do everything amazingly all the time. So, yeah. Moving on. Incapacitated condition, not really a change. They codify a few things, but all that's in there already. We talked about influence already. The invisible condition, exactly what it sounds like. You can't be seen. You have surprise attacks affected. It's basically very, very similar to it's almost identical to the hidden condition. So that's it. The jump action has changed drastically though, and this one is actually pretty cool. Right now, the way jump works is you can jump. Jump is weird, to be blunt. I've got to go to using ability scores. Ability checks. Skills, strength, athletics. Passive checks, working together, group checks. Do they have rules for jumping? They've got to somewhere. Anyway, so there are rules for jumping, and for the life of me, I can't remember where. Maybe it's in combat. Yeah. I think it's movement and position. Moving to using different speeds. Difficult terrain, being prone. Moving around other creatures, flying, moving, creature size, space, squeezing into smaller space, actually counterattack, cast spell, dash, disengage, dodge, help. Where the fuck is jump? I don't remember anymore. So, jump is complicated in 5th edition. I cannot find where they talk about jumping in 5th edition, but the way that it works is you make a roll, and depending on the roll, you can jump a certain distance. It's based on your strength score. And the amount of distance you jump is subtracted from your movement speed for that turn. So even if there's really the only benefit to jumping is if there is no floor. If there's a hole in the ground, you can jump, and that means that you can cross an area. You can cross an area you normally couldn't. That is the only benefit of jump, and because of that, most people don't know the jump rules in D&D 5th edition. And the vertical jump rules, nobody knows those. Myself included. Again, I know enough that I used to know where to look it up, but they show up so infrequently that it's really not worth that much. If I had my physical player's handbook here, instead of... This is so hard there. Instead of back there, I could go to the index and see exactly what they talk about jumping. But they don't have, for whatever reason, I don't think they have... Do they have an index? Appendix E. No, they don't have an index in the D&D Beyond version because technically you're supposed to be able to search for shit. but I can't search the player's handbook for jump. Let's try just jump. I hate stuff like this. See, really? I type jump in and it doesn't give me the rules for jumping. Ring of jumping, moving position. Where the hell are the fuck? Ugh! See, even all right. I'm getting upset about this because it's really stupid. But anyway, so the rules for jumping in 5th edition are dumb. The new version of jumping. With the jump action, you attempt to leap more than 5 feet. A jump of 5 feet or less is treated as difficult terrain. When you take this action, your speed must be greater than 0, and you must make a DC 10 strength check, acrobatics, or athletics. So this is the first time where we actually have a rule that allows you to do something that has technically been possible since the D&D Next playtest, which is, the reason they call it a strength athletics check and not an athletics check is because you can pair strength with technically any other ability. Something like strength intimidation, if you wanted to intimidate someone using your strength rather than your charisma, that makes perfect sense. So in this particular instance, you could do strength acrobatics instead of strength athletics. And that means if you are trained in acrobatics, you can still add your proficiency bonus. Like if you're a monk, let's say, and you're trained in acrobatics, because that's what monks do, but you need to make a jump, you could still add your proficiency bonus. It's just instead of adding your dex bonus to your acrobatics, you add your strength bonus, which is probably negative if you're playing one of the monks I generally play, because you don't use strength as a monk. So now it's a DC 10 strength, acrobatics, or glass checks. If you don't move at least 10 feet immediately before this action, you have disadvantage on the check. On a failed check, you leap 5 feet horizontally or vertically. On a successful check, the check's total determines a distance in feet that you can clear horizontally, or half that total if you're jumping vertically, rounded down. This jump doesn't expend your movement, but the distance you clear can't exceed your speed. So what that effectively means is if you take the jump action, the distance that you physically jump is extra movement for you. So the only limitation to it is you can't make a jump further than your actual speed. So using the jump action, you can't actually move further than effectively double your movement, because your movement speed you can move, and then you can take the jump action and effectively move up to your movement speed for free. That actually makes the jump action useful because it's effectively free movement, and depending on how you're using it, you can use more kind of 3D terrain and have more three-dimensional combats than just, well, I moved the squares over here and then I'm here. No, I'm going to jump up. There's a little kind of outcropping here, right? I'm going to kind of jump up on there, and I'm going to travel along the outcropping so I don't have to deal with the enemies that are blocking me from getting to the caster that I want to kill. So, yeah, I like the changes to the jump action. Again, the jump rules as they currently are, I can't remember them. I can't fucking find them because even searching for the term jump doesn't give you I am flabbergasted that here it is. It's under speed. Your strength determines how far you can jump. Long jump. When you make a long jump, you can cover a number of feet up to your strength score if you move at least 10 feet on foot immediately. Before the jump, when you make a standing long jump, you can only leap half the distance. Either way, each foot you clear on jump costs a foot of movement. The rule assumes that the height of your... And of course, they don't give me... And there's no way to go... Oh, there we go. There we go. Traveling pace, mounts of vehicles, typical terrain. Where is jump? I literally just looked at this section. There it is. Yeah, so the rules are under Chapter 8 Adventuring, Movement Speed, which is where I looked, and I just didn't see it because it's buried. So anyway, the new version to the jump I think is significantly better. The fact that it doesn't take your movement I think makes more sense and gives you a reason to actually want to use it. So moving on. This is getting way too long and I'm getting upset about it. Light's weapon property. This is probably the biggest change, at least to me, because this massively messes with the action economy. When you take the attack action on your turn and attack with a light weapon in one hand, you can make one extra attack as part of the same action. That extra attack must be made with a different light weapon in the other hand, and you don't add your ability modifier to the extra attack's damage. You can make this extra attack only once on each of your turns. And then it says, for example, if you take the attack action on your turn, you have a short sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, each of which has a light property. You can make one attack with each weapon, but you don't add your strength or dex mod to the damage roll of the second weapon. So, pretty simple to understand, but this means two-weapon fighting is no longer uses your bonus action. Two-weapon fighting is entirely built on the attack action, and you still have your bonus action available to do things. When we talk about the classes and that, as far as I can tell, they seem to be taking things that used to be bonus actions and turning them into parts of other actions. And they're, as far as I can tell, like the Bardic Inspiration is no longer a bonus action, it's a reaction. Two-weapon fighting is no longer a bonus action. They're getting rid of a lot of really common uses for your bonus action. I don't know if that means that they are going to give us more varied things you can use your bonus action for. And again, I play a monk, and they don't technically two-weapon fight, but they use their bonus action to effectively two-weapon fight using Unarmed, because they can do a free attack as a bonus action, and then they can burn a key to make two free attacks. So the fact that they've changed it to a property that is exclusive to light weapons and is built entirely into the attack action changes a lot of things. Another thing that I think might become significantly more common is two-weapon fighting with casters. What I mean by that is two-weapon fight with melee casters specifically. Two-weapon fighting, you need you need both your action and your bonus action. And so, if you are playing a caster like a character like an Eldritch Knight or a Blade Singer, using two-weapon fighting generally doesn't tend to be useful, because a lot of times you use your main action to cast a spell, because spells are almost always going to be more powerful than attacks. And in order to get the bonus action offhand attack, you have to use the attack action first. So even Eldritch Knights generally tend to either be dueling style or sword and shield, because there's no real reason for them. They're almost never going to use their bonus action for two-weapon fighting. Now that's built into the attack action. That means that you can bonus action spells. Sorcerers might become significantly more melee focused, because now they can make attacks, they can two-weapon fight, and then also bonus cast a spell with Quicken Spell. And that could be major. Like that would, you could create entire subclasses for the sorcerer built around two-weapon fighting and Quicken Spell casting. Like you could really create some interesting characters. So I think that's probably going to be the most interesting thing, is any spellcaster that uses bonus action spells. Healers that use Healing Word or things like that. Paladins that use smite spells, like branding smite and things like that take your bonus action. I think, or here's another great one: rangers that use Hunter's Mark. Your bonus action generally needs to be used to move your mark, or cast the Hunter's Mark spell. Now, with light weapons being the thing that are with the attack action being all you use, you now can have 2-weapon fighting rangers that can actually use 2-weapon fighting and Hunter's Mark, whereas before it was heavily weighted towards ranged, bow using rangers, simply because they didn't get their benefit from their bonus action being an extra to the attack. So I think this changes things so much. The other thing that I find interesting, and we'll talk about this again when I do my feats video, they do have the dual wielder feat. But the weird thing about the dual wielder feat, I'm going to read it before I say the wrong thing. Dual wielder. Dual wielder now gives you an ability score increase. I think almost all of them do. And then the thing is enhanced dual wielding is the thing that most people take dual wielder for. When you're holding a weapon with the light property in one hand, you can treat a non-light weapon in your other hand as if it had the light property, provided that weapon lacks the two-handed property. In one D&D, it is impossible to dual wield longswords, because in order to use 2-weapon fighting, one of them has to be light. So you also can't you can't dual wield rapiers. Despite the fact, and I've had this argument with quite a few people, like one of the things I hate more than anything else is martial artists specifically that specialize in weaponry that claim to be historical weapons experts. There's quite a few of them on YouTube, and they always talk about dual wielding is a purely fantastical thing. It doesn't exist in real life. No one has ever dual wielded in any historical battle ever, and that is 100% totally false. It has never been true ever. One of my favorite examples, everyone thinks about fencing, and specifically the art of rapier and dagger. That is an actual thing that was taught when fencing was the primary form of sword combat in the Renaissance age, where most nobles would have a rapier on them because that was what you did. And so a lot of people think, well, fighting with a rapier and a dagger, that makes perfect sense. Fighting with a rapier and a rapier, that's impossible. No! There is an entire style of fencing called the Florentine style of fencing, which you used 2 rapiers. 2 full-size rapiers. Everyone that says dual wielding doesn't exist, not only do we know that it exists, there are books on it, and there's there's one specific swordmaster that was writing about fencing in general, and he specifically stated in his treatise on fencing, the Florentine style is the most important style to learn after you learn single rapier combat. More important than rapier and buckler, which was super, super common and a really, really deadly combo. More important than rapier and dagger. More important than rapier and cape, which is an incredibly interesting fighting style that has never showed up in D&D, and I think they need. Combine that with the fact that dual wielding has been documented in actual combat, in war. In China, they had paired broadswords, which are not, little wimpy, short swords or something that they're having. No, paired broadswords are big, thick, like daos, effectively. If you're familiar with the Chinese broadswords, called a dao. Samurai specifically trained in wielding a katana and wakizashi, which you theoretically could call a short sword, but it's a misnomer because, again, a short sword, as it is defined in European swordplay, is a shorter blade. It's still pretty beefy, but it specifically it was specifically made for stabbing. A wakizashi doesn't stab. I mean, it can, like a katana can stab really well as well. So one of the reasons why they were so good at being swords is because they could slash and they could stab relatively well, but they weren't designed to do that. They're both curved blades. And the historical weapons experts Well, actually, what the wakizashi was actually used for is if they were in a situation where quarters were too cramped for their full katana to use, they would pull the wakizashi out because it provided them with a smaller blade that they could more easily use in cramped quarters, which is accurate. But they also used them together. And the katana was a two-handed sword that they wielded one hand and they had the wakizashi in the other. And we have tons and tons and tons of art of it happening. We have tons and tons and tons of surviving historical documents that show how they did it. Like, this is a real thing. Dual wielding is not this, oh, it never happened, it's only in fantasy films. No, it did happen. And it actually was significantly more common. We have more concrete evidence that people dual wielded on the battlefield than we have that the flail was ever used in combat. Fun fact, flails, the only time we have seen flails anywhere, any examples of flails, is in pictures. There is not a single work that describes, how to use a flail in combat. There are no stories that talk about someone riding into combat with a flail. We don't. As far as historians are concerned, they think the flail was a decorative thing that was meant to kind of inspire fear and things like that because it looks really bad. But no one ever used it. Mostly because any kind of flexible weapon like that, you need a lot of training to use it effectively. And it also requires you to have space around you so that you are not hitting other people on your side with it. So, yeah. Anyone that says it dual wielding is just unrealistic and has no problem with players using flails does not know what they're talking about. So anyway, to my knowledge, never in Dungeons and Dragons history have you been unable to dual wield longswords, to use two longswords. Different systems have had different ways to do it. And I know at least one system, it might have been second edition or third edition. I can't remember. It wasn't third edition because third edition just gave you really bad penalties for doing it, but you could totally do it. You just would never hit anything. But one of them, you specifically had to take an ambidexterity feat just because technically it required the weapon in your offhand to be light or something. Because I was looking it up. I want to say it was second edition. Because in order to get the extra attack in second edition, you had to have a light weapon in your offhand. And as soon as you no longer had an offhand because you were ambidextrous, that went away. And so ambidexterity actually let you dual wield two non-light weapons. In 1D&D, you can never do that. At least as far as we can see. Because again, in 5th edition, it basically said you could ignore the light feature when you're dual wielding as long as it's not, as long as it doesn't have the two-handed or heavy feature. So yeah, that is a huge, 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 huge change. And again, this light weapon two weapon attack stuff was already a big change. And yeah, I'll have to see how it goes. I'm not a fan of you have to have one light weapon. I also am not a fan of the term light because, as I mentioned before, a short sword is about 2.5 pounds. A long sword is about 2.5 pounds. Some of them got up to 3.5 pounds. But a short sword and a long sword, a pound of difference does not matter. Even if you're talking about a heavy long sword and a light short sword, we're talking about a pound. It's not the thing that makes two-weapon fighting more difficult is not the weight of the blade. Blades are remarkably light. Weapons in general, remarkably light. It's the length of the blade that makes it difficult. So short-bladed weapons in general are easier to quote-unquote dual wield, to use two at the same time. That's why it's actually not that difficult to have two knives or two daggers and use them together The only thing you have to learn how to do is to coordinate both of your hands. Kali sticks are the same way. Kali sticks are only about that big. And so using them together is not really that difficult. If you extend them to the size of a longsword, they become significantly more difficult to use together because there's just more of them there. There's a better chance you're going to hit yourself. There's a better chance you're going to hit something else because you have to keep track of two different very long things. That's why in Florentine style fencing, technically one of your rapiers was always, almost always, defense, and one of them was offense. And the thing that made the Florentine fencing style so useful was the fact that it wasn't like the rapier and dagger style, where they could always tell that your left hand was your parry hand. And so if they avoided your left hand, they would force you to use your rapier to parry, and you couldn't riposte with a dagger. It was never long enough. The Florentine style, you could use either one, and you were trained to constantly switch between which one was your attacking rapier and which one was your defending rapier. It was very rare that you would ever strike with both at the same time, and in general, the reason behind that was just it left you far too open to an attack. But there were a few things, like a double thrust or something like that, if you wanted to get really fancy. But in general, you would, like, there was some where you would have one out like this and then one up here. There's attack styles like this, and you would constantly be switching which one was your leading rapier and which one was your backup rapier. You would constantly be switching between which one you were going to parry with, and because of the length of the blades, you could be incredibly deadly, even to someone that had a parrying dagger or a buckler or a cape, though the cape was significantly more useful because it could actually trap weapon. Cape and rapier fencing is massively cool. I love it. It is the coolest thing. I want to see rules for it in D&D because it is by far the coolest dueling style ever. So anyway, yeah, I'm conflicted about this. We'll see how it goes. Right now, they've taken away a lot of uses for the bonus action, and right now the bonus action, unless you're a spellcaster, your bonus action is worthless for most characters now. So I want to see what they're going to do to give characters more things they can use their bonus action for. They didn't give the bard anything to do with it, so, but the bard is a spellcaster, so. And the changes they made to the bard anyway are pushing it much more towards healer than it used to be. Moving on, long rest. Almost nothing changes except you get all your spent hit dice instead of half your spent hit dice. Other than that, it's identical. Oh, and it also says ability scores restored. If any of your ability scores were reduced, they return to normal. There are so few things in D&D 5th edition that change your ability scores. I think there's maybe half a dozen monsters that'll drain ability scores. That they've never needed to make that a rule. They would just make it a rule in the monster stat block. I kind of hope that means that it's going to become something that more monsters can do, because that's another thing that I think can make even high-level combat significantly more scary. Which you should be afraid of in combat. It's not fun if it's boring. There is now the magic action. So whenever you cast a spell that has a casting time of an action, or you use a magic item that requires an action to be activated, you're using the same action, which is the magic action. As of right now, this is mostly just semantic change, but if they change, like the counterspell, if they change counterspell from when you cast a spell to when someone uses the magic action, if they just made that tiny change, that would mean you can now counterspell magic items that have magical properties that you can use with them, and that would be a pretty big deal. Theoretically, you could counterspell we call it the Pokeball. I can never remember what it's called, but it's like the Binding Bands of Iron or something like that. But it's basically all these little. It's a rubber ball band, but instead of rubber, it is magic bands of iron that when you throw it and say the command word, it opens up and then collapses on somebody and restrains them. It's one of my favorite magic items that nobody uses. and I love it. Every campaign I've run, I have put it somewhere in the campaign for the players to find, and we just call it the Pokeball, but it's fun. So yeah, that not a huge change. It's mostly semantic right now, but it hints that they might make other changes. And I'm not sure. Again, I don't think I'd be 100% against the idea of counterspell working on magic items as well, or just magic abilities. Because right now, when they changed how spellcasting monsters work in Monsters of the Multiverse, it effectively means that spellcasting monsters can't be counterspelled because they're not casting spells, they're using spell-like abilities. In the specific wording of counterspell, you can't counterspell that. So with this change to magic, that might also include magic abilities. We're just going to call it a magic action. And so again, there's a lot that this could be, or it could be semantics. We don't know. Moving on. Move. There's nothing here. They have stuff about moving through creatures and stuff like that, but I believe all of this is pretty standard for what D&D 5th edition is already. Musical instruments, we already know about that. Primal spells, already know about it. Ritual casting, nothing's changed. The search action we already talked about. The short sword has been changed from a martial weapon to a simple weapon. It's another thing that doesn't make a ton of sense to me because we already have a pokey simple weapon. That's the dagger. That's what the dagger is there for. Is a pokey simple weapon. Effectively, the short sword being a martial weapon was effectively so that when you were dual wielding, because there's a light weapon, you could have any of the three major damage types. If you wanted to dual wield blunt damage, you'd use light hammers. If you wanted to dual wield slashing damage, you would use either hand axes or scimitars. And if you wanted to dual wield piercing damage, you would use short swords. Now there is no piercing damage weapon in the martial weapon category. So I do find that a little bit weird. I think it might just have to do with the fact that there were a few classes that would get simple weapons and short sword. So it might... I guess I just don't understand why short sword needs to be a simple weapon now. And it doesn't... It's still more complicated to use than a dagger, to where someone that knows... Like, fun fact, most people, if you give them a knife or a dagger, and for anyone wondering, the difference between a knife and a dagger is a knife has a single edge, a dagger has two. It's the only difference. Yeah, if you have a pocket knife that has two edges, that's a pocket dagger, not a pocket knife. So anyway, if you give anybody a knife or a dagger, the vast majority of people can defend themselves relatively well with it because it's a really simple weapon. And fun fact, the most effective way to use a dagger is not stabbing, it is slashing. The best way, and the way that most people use it because it's instinctive, is you just do this. You just swing it at someone and hope that it cuts. And because of that, they've done studies with police officers and things like that. If someone is within, I think it's 20 feet. If someone is within 20 feet and they have a knife and you have a gun, you're dead. Because they can cover 20 feet and kill you with the knife faster than you can stop them with a gun. Even if I can't remember if that includes draw time or whatever but the 20-foot window is something that they teach all police officers. If somebody is within 20 feet of you, your gun ain't going to stop them, because even if you can shoot them before they get to you, your gun does not have enough stopping power that it's going to stop their full tilt run. You will slow them down, but they will still get close enough to you to hurt you, sometimes fatally. So yeah, daggers are remarkably simple to be effective with. Short swords, again, it's not that they're bigger or heavier, it's that they have a longer blade. And because of that, it means that you have to use them very, very differently. Especially since a short sword, you can slice with a short sword, but it is designed to stab. It is designed to be a piercing weapon. And to use it effectively, you need a little bit of training. So it makes sense for a short sword to be a martial weapon, because not everyone can pick up a short sword and be good with it. Almost anybody can pick up a dagger or a knife and be dangerous with it to someone else, to someone other than themselves. So, yeah, again, I don't know why they did that, but I was reading through the Rogue, and they no longer, I think it was the Rogue. It's either the Rogue or the Bard. They no longer get proficiency in any martial weapons. They just get simple weapons. And they kept talking about short swords. I'm like, why the hell are you talking about short swords? Rogues can't use short swords. You took away that proficiency. So I thought it was really weird until, again, I read the end. I went, oh, short swords are... They don't mention that anywhere in the document. I had to find that out after I read to the end. So, Wizards, stop doing this. This is dumb. Moving on. Slowed condition, already talked about that. Steady action, already talked about that. Swim speed, tool proficiency. Teleportation, they clarify here. It's the exact same as teleportation in 5th edition D&D, so it's not a big deal. Tremor sense, they clarify in here. They do specifically say a creature with tremor sense can pinpoint the location of creatures and moving objects within a specific range, provided that the creature with tremor sense and anything it's detecting are both in contact with the same surface, such as the ground, a wall, or a ceiling, or the same liquid. So tremor sense, first of all, works in liquids. Second of all, they do kind of clarify the same surface. So if you're on the ground and a creature's on the ceiling, like it's crawling, your tremor sense won't let you see it. Or if it's running on the wall and you're touching the ground, because it's technically a different surface, and they, such as the ground, a wall, or a ceiling, since they clarify those 3 different things count as 3 different surfaces. That's always been kind of an argument in the D&D community of, well, does tremor sense, does that mean if I can trace a path up to the ceiling, can I see something on the ceiling? Nope, it has to be on the same surface. And then the final thing is Unarmed Strike. We talked about that already. I like the new version of Unarmed Strike. I think it's cool. So, final thoughts. Overall, I think there's less bad things in this set of rules than the last one. But I have a few things I'm not super pleased about. Like I said, I think guidance has been nerfed too much. Not that guidance didn't need a nerf. It's just the way that they nerfed it, I think they took to an extreme. The light weapon thing I'm not particularly fond about, but the fact that it's built in the attack action I think is interesting and could be cool, or it could be a massive screw up. We have to see what they do next. The rest of the stuff, like I said, for the most part, I think these are all steps in a direction I think is positive. There's still not enough here that I think we can really get an idea of what one D&D is going to turn into. But I like what I'm seeing here for the most part. Like I said, there's some weird stuff. They mess around with some semantics a little bit, but for the most part, I think most of the changes here reflect that they're listening to people and they're thinking outside the box to try some new things. I'm interested to see where they go. However, that's going to be all for me today. As always, remember, like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, turn notifications on. All things are super, super important in the comments down below. What do you think, in your opinion, is the biggest rules change? Is it the 2-weapon fighting thing? Is it just the change to crits and getting heroic inspiration on nat ones now? What do you think is the biggest change? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's all for me today, and I'll see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.